My husband's brother said she married for money. He had no idea about the other policy. Archie called me 4 days after we buried Lloyd and said, in the flat voice he reserved for women he had already accounted for, "Simone, I need to talk to you about the insurance. There's a process, and you should understand where you stand." He meant the company policy, $250,000, naming the estate, the number the Barker family had organized their assumptions around. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when he said it. The red accordion folder was in my hands. I had taken it down from the closet shelf that morning without quite knowing why, and I was holding it the way you hold something familiar when the world has become unfamiliar. I thought, in that exact moment, about what Lloyd had said the Saturday he brought the documents home. He had said, "I want you to have something that's just yours." The private policy was $1.8 million. I had not told Archie. I had not told anyone. What he never knew, when he called that morning to explain to me where I stood, was that I was already holding the piece of paper that made his explanation irrelevant. Good day, dear listeners. It's Ren again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that grief is the great equalizer. I used to believe that. I used to think that loss pressed everyone down to the same level, that it stripped away the pretensions and the performances and left people standing in something honest. And it does do that. Grief removes the decorative layers. But what I learned in the weeks after Lloyd died is that grief also removes the filter people usually maintain over their assumptions. It makes them bold. It makes them move fast. Have you ever noticed how quickly people reveal what they were already thinking the moment they believe the social cost of revelation has dropped? The Barker family had spent 7 years treating me as a provisional presence, not quite excluded, never quite welcomed, always assessed, always slightly outside the configuration of their central concerns. When Lloyd died, they moved. They gathered within 48 hours. They organized. They arrived at conclusions. What they did not do, in all of that purposeful, efficient grieving, was ask whether they had the complete picture. They had not moved quickly enough. And there is a particular kind of lesson in that, in the way certainty rushes in when it senses a vacuum, and how certainty is almost always the last thing you should trust when the facts are still arriving. The facts were still arriving. They simply had not yet reached the Barker family. I had been a certified medical coder for 12 years before Lloyd and I married. 12 years of precisely this kind of work. Reading coverage documents, tracing claim structures, understanding the specific legal language of a policy versus what the person holding the policy assumes that language means. I used to tell people that medical coding was about translation, not from one language to another, but from what a document said to what it actually meant in practice, and from what a provider billed to what a carrier would actually recognize. The gap between those two things is where the work lived. It is also where the most consequential differences hide. Have you ever read a document carefully and realized that everything you assumed about it was correct on the surface and wrong at the center? That is the daily experience of medical coding. You learn to hold surface and structure simultaneously, to see the form and the meaning as separate objects, to distrust the summary and read the original. I carried that habit into every part of my life. I carried it into the Barker family, where it was entirely invisible to them, because they had decided what I was before they needed to look carefully. People who have already made up their minds do not tend to read the fine print. I was 39 years old when Lloyd died. We had been married for 7 years. I had spent those 7 years working remotely from the home office in the Federal Hill house and attending the Barker family gatherings at the East Side house, where the furniture was heavy and the rooms were formal, and Archie referred to me as Lloyd's wife, with a consistency that I had long since stopped attributing to forgetfulness. The East Side house had the particular atmosphere of a house decorated once, with money and intention, and then never reconsidered. The curtains had been chosen for a specific vision, and the house had grown around that vision without anyone questioning it. Gordon Sr. held court there. He had always held court there, from a standing position near the fireplace in the formal sitting room, delivering verdicts about financial matters with the authority of a man who has never been seriously contested. He had directed Lloyd to carry the company-issued policy, $250,000, naming the estate as beneficiary, and had never once inquired whether Lloyd held coverage through any other channel, because the idea had not occurred to him. He was a man who assumed comprehensiveness without verifying it. In my profession, we call that a documentation gap. I had learned, over 12 years, never to assume that the policy in front of you was the only policy in existence. He had not learned this. He did not know about the red accordion folder. Our house in Federal Hill was the opposite of the East Side house in every way that mattered. It was a row house on a street where the neighbors knew each other, and the woman across the way knocked if she hadn't seen your lights in 2 days. The kitchen always smelled like coffee. The floors were original wood, worn smooth in the specific places we walked most often. The path from the door to the stove, the short path from the hallway to the bedroom. The bedroom closet was narrow, and on the top shelf, precisely centered, sat the red accordion folder in the particular shade of red that has no other name but red. Not crimson, not burgundy, just red. The clean, utilitarian red of something purchased to do a job and doing it without apology. I had placed it there in 2019. I had looked at it every morning for 5 years while I chose what to wear. It had become part of the architecture of ordinary days, the way certain objects do, present, unremarked upon, carrying more than anyone outside that room would have known. Do you know that feeling? The feeling of something that holds its importance quietly, saying nothing, waiting for the moment it is needed? Lloyd was 44 when he died in a construction accident on a site outside Providence. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, when the light was doing that particular thing it does in New England in late autumn, thin and very clear, cutting in at an angle through the kitchen window and lying across the floor in long pale strips. I was at the counter with my coffee. The phone rang. The world changed. I want to say something careful here, because I will not let this story become a story that is only about money, because it was not only about money, and I would not be honest with you if I allowed that impression to stand. Lloyd was a good man. He was a careful man. He was a man who drove home very quiet after difficult days and then came back to himself in the kitchen, making dinner, the radio on low. He was the man I had chosen and who had chosen me, and the choosing had been genuine on both sides, whatever Archie had decided to believe about it. The money is what this story turns on, but Lloyd is what this story is about. I need you to understand that before we go any further. The first sign that the Barker family's concern was not entirely about grief came in the second week after the funeral, when Archie called to ask whether I had received any communications from Lloyd's financial contacts. He framed it as helpfulness. He said he wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed by paperwork, that he could help sort through anything official. It was a thoughtful thing to say. It was timed in a way that did not feel like coincidence, not the call of a grieving brother reaching out to a grieving widow, but the call of someone conducting an inventory while the inventory still seemed manageable. I told him I was managing, thanked him, And after the call ended, I sat with the particular stillness of someone who has just heard a sentence that was designed to sound like one thing and meant another. Archie was not calling to protect me from paperwork. I recognized the move because I had spent 12 years in a profession where the difference between a genuine inquiry and a coverage investigation was entirely a matter of phrasing. You learned to hear the architecture beneath the words. The architecture of Archie's call was not concern. It was accounting. The second sign was documentary. And it arrived 10 days later in an envelope addressed to me personally, not to the estate, not to any joint account, to me by name, at the Federal Hill address, from the office of Gordon Sr.'s financial advisor. It was a letter requesting a complete list of any accounts or policies held jointly or individually by Lloyd at the time of his death. Standard estate administration language, polite and precise, formatted on professional letterhead with a 2-week response deadline. I read it 3 times. I set it on the kitchen table. I left it there for an hour while I made lunch and washed the dishes, and then I picked it up and read it a 4th time. A routine estate administrative inquiry comes from the executor's attorney, is directed to all named parties through a structured legal channel, and references the specific legal instrument that governs its authority. This letter came from a financial advisor. It was addressed to me, alone. It arrived in the week before I had retained my own representation, at a moment when Gordon Sr. and Archie had every reason to believe I was still learning how to stand upright in the morning. I filed it in a manila envelope. I wrote the date on the outside in black ink. I had already decided, by that point, to call Renata. I want to be honest with you about something, listeners. I had known Renata Sousa's name for 2 years before I called her. A colleague had recommended her after navigating her own inheritance dispute, and I had written the name and number in the back of a small notebook in my desk drawer, and I had thought, periodically, that I should have my own representation, someone separate from any advisor connected to the Barker name. I thought about it and did not do it, not because I was incautious, but because I was still making the particular calculation that women in difficult families often make, the one that says, perhaps if I remain undemanding enough, the weight will lift on its own. Have you ever made that calculation? Have you ever stayed smaller than you needed to be because smallness felt like the safe position? I made it for several years. I know how it ends. I called Renata the morning I received the financial advisor's letter. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Tell me what you have." I told her. She said, "Come in Thursday." That was all. But before I tell you about Thursday, I need to take you back further, back to a Saturday afternoon in March of 2019, because that Saturday is where this story actually begins. Not the accident, not the funeral, not Archie's call. A Saturday afternoon in a Federal Hill kitchen with afternoon light on the table and a manila envelope between us. It was the first weekend after a particularly difficult gathering at the Eastside house, a dinner at which Archie had said something within earshot that I was not meant to hear, and that I heard clearly. He had told a cousin, in the approximate direction of the dining room corner, that I had married Lloyd for money, and that I would find out what that was worth. I had not reacted when I heard it. I had continued eating. I had thought, with the specific calm of someone who has decided not to give a person the satisfaction they are seeking, that I would not let it show. Lloyd was across the table. He had heard it too. I knew by the way his jaw set, and the way he went very still for a moment before picking up his fork and saying something ordinary to his mother. The way a man does when he is managing his own reaction rather than producing someone else's scene. I want to stay in that dining room for a moment longer, because the geography of it matters. The East Side house had a formal dining room with a table that seated 12 and was set for 9 at Thanksgiving. Gordon Sr. sat at the head. Lloyd's mother, Diane, sat at the other end. The children, as Gordon Sr. still called the adult members of the family, were arranged between them. I was seated between Lloyd and the window, a position that was, I understood even then, not hostile but peripheral. The placement of someone the table was making room for rather than centering. The comment came when a cousin arrived late, and Archie went to the entry hall to greet him. They stood just through the doorway, in the partial visibility of an adjoining room where voices carry if the dining room is quiet enough. Which it was. I heard Archie say it. He said it casually, in the tone he used for things he considered settled and uninteresting. The cousin laughed. Archie came back to the table and sat down and reached for his wine and said something to Marisol. He looked once in my direction. Not at me, in my direction. And then he looked away. I ate my dinner. I answered questions when they were directed at me. I was in black that day too. Not morning black, just the black I wore to family gatherings because it required no decisions. Lloyd's hand found mine under the table at some point during dessert, briefly, and I let it stay. That was all that was said between us on the subject that evening. But his hand found mine, and I knew he had heard. He drove home very quiet that night. We got home, and I made tea, and he sat at the kitchen table, and was quiet in the way that meant he was working something out, and I let him. We drank our tea. We went to bed. The following Saturday, he came back from an errand mid-afternoon with a manila envelope and sat across from me at that same kitchen table, the one nearest the window, with the late daylight coming in from the west. He placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward me. He explained the policy, the coverage amount, $1.8 million on a 20-year term, the annual premium he would pay from his personal account, the independent broker he had engaged. He said he had not told his family. He said he did not intend to tell his family. He said, "I don't want anyone else to have a say in what you get." Then he said, "I want you to have something that's just yours." Simply, without flourish, in the voice he used for things he had thought through carefully and arrived at cleanly. I asked how long he had been thinking about this. He said, longer than last week. He had been in motion before Archie said a word at that dinner. The comment had confirmed a conclusion he had already been approaching. He filed the application that Monday. The policy was issued and active within 30 days. I filed the confirmation in the red accordion folder and put the folder on the top shelf of the closet, and he paid the premium every year until the November he died. The first time I truly understood what the folder represented, not intellectually, not in terms of the dollar amount, but in the way that understanding lands in the body rather than the mind, was a morning in February, 9 months before the accident. I had been working a complicated week of claims for a hospital client, one of those stretches where every file had an exception and every exception had a sub-exception, and I had gone to the bedroom closet for something unrelated, and the red folder was there on the shelf, and I stopped, with my hand on the edge of the shelf, and thought, Lloyd did this. He thought it through, and then he let it sit on this shelf and trusted it to do its job. And I thought that I trusted it too. Not because I had any reason to believe I would need it soon. Lloyd was healthy and 43 and working steady. But because it was there, correctly done, correctly filed, in the place where it was supposed to be. There is a specific kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing a thing is in order. I carried it with me back into that complicated week of claims, and it helped in a way I could not entirely have explained. The folder did not move from that shelf in the 9 months that followed. It was there on the morning I needed it. I need to tell you about the inciting incident before I can tell you about Renata's office. Because the sequence matters and I want you to feel it in the right order. 4 days after the funeral, I drove to the East Side house for what Gordon Sr. had called, in his message, a family conversation about the estate. I wore black. I had been in black since the morning after the service. The sitting room was arranged with the kind of care that expresses itself as furniture placement. Good chairs set in a configuration that placed me at the outer edge of the grouping rather than the center. I had seen this configuration before. At Thanksgiving one year, Archie had positioned me similarly at the dining table, and it had taken me 2 gatherings to understand that it was not accidental, but habitual. Marisol was beside Archie on the sofa nearest the window. She had sat with me at the funeral and held my hand through the service. She looked at our hands now. Gordon Sr. stood near the fireplace. He produced a policy summary from a folder on the side table and placed it on the low table between us with a gentleness I recognized as the gentleness of managed information, a softness of manner calibrated to make a difficult thing land more gently. He said this was the company-issued life insurance policy, $250,000, naming the estate as beneficiary, and that the estate administration process would proceed in the usual way and my share would be distributed through probate in due course. Archie said, "That's the insurance. The estate processes it and you'll receive your share." He said it in the tone he used for conclusions, the tone of a man presenting a reality rather than inviting a discussion. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the policy summary on the table, as though confirming a figure he had already memorized. I looked at the policy summary as well. I read the coverage amount. I read the beneficiary line. I said, "Thank you for walking me through this." Evenly, I picked up my bag. I shook Gordon Sr.'s hand at the door. In the car, sitting in the driveway of the East Side house for 3 minutes before I started the engine, I thought about the red accordion folder on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. I thought about the $1.8 million. I thought about the fact that I had not mentioned either of those things, and that no one in that room had asked. The drive home from the East Side to Federal Hill takes 11 minutes at that hour. I know because I have made it many times and I know the lights. That evening it felt shorter than usual, or perhaps I was more interior than usual. The kitchen smelled like the coffee I had left in the pot that morning. I stood at the counter for a few minutes in the dark before I turned the light on. Then I went to the bedroom, took the red accordion folder down from the shelf and set it on the bed. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it, the clean utilitarian red of it, unchanged since 2019, the accordion pleats slightly compressed from years of sitting still. I sat there for a moment and thought about Lloyd's face on that Saturday afternoon in the kitchen. He had been satisfied, not proud, not triumphant, satisfied. The specific satisfaction of a man who had done a careful thing correctly and then let it be. I picked up my phone and called Renata. It was 7:45 in the evening. She answered. The call lasted 90 minutes. Renata asked questions in the order she needed them answered, which was not the order I would have presented them, and I found that useful. It meant she was working the problem from a structure I had not built, finding angles I might have missed. She asked for the policy document, the beneficiary designation, the annual renewal confirmations, who had paid the premium and from which account, whether the policy had been purchased independently or with any involvement from a financial advisor or family member, whether Lloyd had ever mentioned it to anyone in his family, whether I had. Finally, had I filed a claim? I said no. I explained that I had not been sure whether to proceed with the family's estate process underway. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should file today." She added, "This policy is a beneficiary-designated instrument. It passes outside the estate entirely. Probate has no authority over it." the executor, has no authority over it. The Barker family's estate administration process does not touch it. I said I understood. She said, Thursday, bring the folder. Renata's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Providence. Clean, direct, no artwork on the walls, no decorative objects on the desk, just a long credenza of organized files and the desk itself, large and clear-surfaced, with room to place things side by side when you needed to compare them. Her directness was immediate and complete. She did not warm up to questions. She asked them. When I arrived that Thursday with the red accordion folder, her assistant brought me water, and she came in and sat and said, without any greeting, "Let me see it." I opened the folder and placed the private policy on the desk. She read it from the first page, without expression. When she reached the coverage amount, she paused. When she reached the beneficiary line, she looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "He purchased this independently?" I said yes. She said, "Through what channel?" I gave her the broker's name. She wrote it down. Then she took the company policy summary and placed it beside the private policy on the desk, the two documents side by side, the two numbers adjacent, $250,000 and $1,800,000. She looked at both for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "This private policy is a beneficiary designated instrument. It passes entirely outside the estate. Probate has no authority over it. No executor, no family member, no estate administrator has any legal standing to claim, delay, or challenge its distribution to you as the named sole primary beneficiary, absent a specific legal basis for contesting the designation itself." She paused. "Has anyone in the Barker family raised any concern about the circumstances of this policy's issuance?" I said no. She said, "File the claim today. I'll contact the carrier to confirm receipt. And don't discuss this with anyone in the family until I tell you otherwise." She handed the folder back to me. I took it. She nodded once, the equivalent, I had come to understand, of a full sentence of reassurance. I want to tell you what it felt like to drive home from Renata's office that day, because it is not what you might expect. The $1.8 million had been real since 2019. It had been sitting on that shelf all that time, but it had lived in my understanding as a number, as a document, as a thing Lloyd had done for me, rather than as a material fact about to become visible to people who had no idea it existed. Driving home through Providence on that November Thursday, the light already dropping by 4 in the afternoon, I understood for the first time that what I held was not just security. It was a reconfiguration. The Barker family believed they knew the complete picture of Lloyd's estate. They believed the picture was a $250,000 company policy distributing through probate on their timeline. The picture was not that. The picture had an entirely different center, and they had not yet seen it. And they would not see it until the process had already completed. I parked on the Federal Hill Street. I sat in the car for a few minutes before I went inside. I thought about the difference between what people are certain they know and what they actually know. Then I went inside and made dinner and called a friend who had been checking on me and talked about something else entirely for an hour. And that was its own kind of necessary. The carrier confirmed receipt of the claim within 3 business days. Renata's message arrived, receipt confirmed. Clock starts. 30 days from death certificate filing. The death certificate had been filed the Thursday after the accident. That put the processing deadline in mid-December. I noted the date. I went back to the daily structure of grief, not linear, as people who haven't lived it tend to imagine, but textured, running through ordinary time in unpredictable ways. I made coffee. I answered messages. I sat with the Federal Hill quiet. I repainted the hall closet that November, the one along the staircase, not the bedroom closet, which I did not touch. Because I needed something to do with my hands, and I needed to feel that I was making something better, making something mine, with the intention and effort of a person who intended to remain precisely where they were. Archie's first call in the processing window came on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after the claim was filed. It was framed as estate coordination, working through the asset inventory, making sure everything was properly documented. Thoroughness was what the process required. He was polite. He was organized. He was conducting an inventory, which is not the same as being helpful. And the difference was entirely audible if you had learned to hear it. I told him I had retained an attorney, and that all questions about the estate or any related matters should be directed to her. I gave him Renata's number. He thanked me. I heard him writing it down. I ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought, he is going to call her. What he did not know was what Renata would say, and what she would not. I had asked Renata at our second meeting about exactly this scenario. What happens when the family calls you? She had said, when they call, I'll confirm what is already legally theirs to know. Nothing beyond that. I had asked whether that created any exposure. She had said very flatly, the private policy's existence is not information the Barker family has any current legal standing to receive. Before the claim processes and the proceeds transfer, you are not withholding anything from anyone with a legal right to it. You are protecting a legally designated beneficiary instrument. That is not a gray area. That is the function the instrument was designed for. I had understood. The instrument was designed to pass directly to the named beneficiary without requiring anyone's permission. That design was the point. Lloyd had understood the design. He had chosen it deliberately. He had paid for it every year and let it sit on a shelf and trust in its own correctness. I thought, sitting in the Federal Hill kitchen after Archie's call, that this was a very particular kind of faith, the faith of a careful man in a correctly executed document. He called Renata's office the following Thursday afternoon. She called me immediately after. He had asked, in a tone she described as barely courteous, whether there were other insurance instruments he should be aware of for the estate inventory. She had told him the estate inventory was her client's concern. The company policy was an estate asset being processed through probate accordingly. And she was not in a position to share additional information about her client's affairs. She had not confirmed or denied anything beyond what was legally his to know. She said, he pushed twice. I said the same thing twice. Then he thanked me and ended the call. I asked whether she thought he had understood what the deflection meant. She said, he understands something exists that he can't see. That will concern him. It should. A pause. The clock is still running. You're fine. I said, thank you, Renata, she said. Don't thank me until it transfers. In the second week of the processing window, I received a call from a number I did not recognize. A man identified himself as a representative from the carrier's claims processing department, routine beneficiary verification, he said. Confirming designation details for the active claim on file. He asked for my full name, date of birth, the policy number, and my relationship to the insured at the time of the policy's issuance. I provided each item clearly and correctly. He confirmed the information against the file. He said, everything is consistent with the application documentation. Thank you for your time. He said it with the particular neutrality of a professional, confirming that all the pieces are where they are supposed to be, and that nothing about the situation surprises him. He ended the call. In 12 years of medical coding, I had made calls exactly like that one, from the other side, the verification call that is not really verification but confirmation. The procedural step that happens when the claim is clean and the processor is moving it through. The call told me, in the professional language I had been trained to read, that the claim was processing without complication and that no flag had been raised against the beneficiary designation. I made coffee. I went back to work. The proceeds transferred in the second week of December. A Wednesday, mid-afternoon, that same thin Providence light that had attended every important moment of that period. Renata's message arrived at 3:17, processed. Full amount. Call me when you can. I called her from the kitchen. She said, $1.8 million, net of the one administrative fee we discussed, deposited to the account you designated. I set the phone down for a moment. I stood very still. Not because I was surprised, I had understood the legal mechanism and trusted the documentation, but because there is a difference between knowing a thing and the moment it becomes irrevocably, concretely real. The difference requires its own brief silence. I gave it that. Then I said, "Thank you." She said, "Now we wait for the family." I asked, "How long?" She said, "A week, maybe 2. Someone will find a filing reference." She was right. It took 8 days. What I did not yet know, on that Wednesday in December, was what Archie was looking at on the same afternoon. He had been moving through the estate's insurance documentation with the methodical attention of a man who considers financial administration a form of authority. And in that process, he had encountered a public claim filing reference, a standard administrative record that accompanies any insurance claim above a certain threshold, generated automatically by the carrier. The reference was associated with my name and a policy number that did not match the company policy. He spent some time, I imagine, trying to reconcile what he was looking at with what he believed he knew. He could not reconcile it. I know this because of the quality of his voice when he called me on that Friday evening, not his usual organized certainty. Something different, something that had encountered a category it had not been prepared for. He called at 6:15. I was in the kitchen making dinner. The red accordion folder was on the counter. I had taken it out that morning to locate the original broker contact information, and I had not yet put it away. I answered. He said, "Simone, just the name." I said yes. He said he was looking at an insurance claim filing reference associated with my name and a policy number that did not match the company instrument. He asked whether I had filed something separately. I said yes. He asked the carrier. I told him. He asked, "How much?" I said $1.8 million. The pause that followed was not a conversational pause. It was 8 seconds, I counted, the pause of a man whose mental architecture had just encountered a structural load it had not been designed to carry. The entire floor plan of his assumptions had held for 12 days of efficient organizing, and it was no longer holding. He said, "How much?" Again, quietly, not with anger. With the specific quality of a person repeating a number their mind has not yet processed. I said it again. $1.8 million. He said nothing else. The call ended. I stood in the kitchen. The dinner was on the stove. The red accordion folder was on the counter, splayed slightly at the spine from where I had set it down at an angle when I reached for the phone. I closed it carefully, pressing the accordion pleats flat, the way you close something that has finished its work and can now rest. I thought about Archie's voice in that 8th second, not what he said, because he said nothing, but the texture of the silence itself, the specific quality of a man who has understood that the landscape is entirely different from the map he had been using. I did not feel triumph. That is the honest thing to tell you. What I felt was closer to the sensation of setting something heavy down after a long walk, Not relief exactly, but the specific physical recognition that the weight has transferred from where it was to where it belonged. I put the folder on the counter. I finished dinner. I ate alone at the kitchen table, and the house was quiet, and I thought about Lloyd. Gordon Sr. received the news within 48 hours. Renata received a call from Gordon Sr.'s attorney on the Monday of the following week, requesting information about the circumstances of the private policy's issuance. She was not surprised. She had the documentation ready before the attorney finished asking the question. The original 2019 application with Lloyd's signature, the independent broker's records, the carrier's issuance documentation, and the capacity and circumstances assessment that accompanied every policy of that type and threshold. Independent submission, independent broker, online application. No third-party involvement at any stage. She sent the package the same afternoon. It was complete, and it was clear. The formal challenge arrived 6 weeks after the claim processed. Archie, through Gordon Sr., as attorney, filed a challenge with the carrier on the grounds of undue influence, the contention that Lloyd had been pressured into naming me as sole beneficiary rather than having acted independently. Renata explained the process. The carrier's underwriting team would review the challenge against the 2019 application materials, 3 to 4 weeks, and then it would be over. She said it with the flatness of certainty. I asked what the realistic outcomes were. She said, the application was submitted online, independently, without the presence of any third party. The independent broker's engagement record notes explicitly that the client initiated contact without referral from any existing family financial arrangement and requested that the policy not be linked to any existing family accounts. The capacity assessment at issuance is clean. An undue influence claim requires evidence of third-party involvement and evidence of impaired capacity. There is no evidence of either. She paused. The challenge will be reviewed. It will be found without basis. It will be withdrawn. I asked, and if it's not? She said, it will be. She said it the way she said everything that was true, without decoration and with no room in the sentence for doubt. Gordon Sr.'s attorney made one additional attempt in the second week of the review period. A letter arrived at Renata's office arguing that Lloyd's decision to purchase a private policy without informing his family represented a departure from his established financial behavior, that he had always deferred to his father's guidance in matters of this scale, and that the private purchase therefore suggested external influence. Renata drafted the response in under an hour and sent it the same afternoon. She attached the independent broker's engagement record, dated March 11, 2019, which noted that the client had contacted the broker directly, without any referral from a family member or financial advisor, and had explicitly requested that the policy not be linked to any existing family financial arrangements. 3 days before Lloyd came home with the envelope that Saturday. He had already been in motion before he told me. He had started the process on a Monday of the prior week and had come home the following Saturday to explain what he had done, to show me the documentation, to place the manila envelope on the table and push it toward me. The response made clear that the departure from established behavior was, in fact, the point. The documentation of independence was as thorough as the independence itself. That line of argument was withdrawn within the week, without response. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks of the review period because they were not comfortable. The story, from the outside, has the clean lines of an outcome already decided. The documentation was solid. The challenge had nothing to stand on. But sitting inside that weight, making coffee and working and lying awake some nights in the specific quiet of a house where one person is permanently absent, it did not feel clean. It felt like what it was, a woman holding very still while something important moved through its process, unable to accelerate it and unwilling to flinch at it. I thought, during those weeks, about Lloyd's face. Not the Saturday in 2019 specifically, I had been over that memory many times, but the general quality of his attention. He was deliberate. He thought things through, and then trusted the result. He had purchased the policy in 2019 and had never revisited it, never adjusted it, never told anyone. He had trusted the document to do what properly executed documents do. He had been right to trust it, and the review period would confirm that. I knew this. What I also knew was that knowing and waiting are not the same thing, and that the waiting was its own cost, paid in sleepless nights, and the specific effort of remaining composed when the outcome was still formally undecided. I paid it. That is also part of the story. There was an afternoon during the second week of the review period that I want to tell you about, because it captures something true about that time that I have not yet said. I was at my desk working on a hospital client's batch, routine coding, the kind of work I can do in a state of partial attention, when I stopped and sat back in the chair and looked at the room. The home office, Lloyd's construction drawings in their tube in the corner, a bookshelf he had built himself, slightly uneven on the right side, which he had always intended to fix and never had. The window onto the Federal Hill Street, where a neighbor was walking a dog I did not recognize, and the afternoon light on the pavement outside was the same thin. Clear November light that had been with me since the accident. I thought about Archie's voice on the phone. Not the 8-second pause, I had thought about that enough, but the voice before the pause. The confident, organized voice of a man walking me through a situation he understood completely, in the flat tone he reserved for women he had already accounted for. He had been so certain. He had been certain the way people are certain when they have stopped at the first answer that fit and never looked for the second. I thought about the red accordion folder on the shelf. I thought about Lloyd on a Monday morning in March 2019, sitting down at a computer to contact an independent insurance broker, without telling his father, without telling Archie, without telling anyone. One deliberate, careful, quiet Monday morning, against a backdrop of 7 years of Thanksgiving dinners and policy summaries, and a chair at the edge of the room. I thought. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway, in silence. And then he came home on Saturday and put the envelope on the table and told me. And I thought that this was the most specific act of love I had ever witnessed. Not grand, not announced, just correct and permanent and aimed precisely at what I would need. I went back to work. I was all right. Renata called on a Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen. The kettle was on. I was holding the red accordion folder. I had taken it down that morning without knowing it would be the morning, in the same way I had taken it down on the morning Archie first called, some part of me tracking something before the rest of me named it. She said, "The challenge has been withdrawn." The carrier reviewed the full 2019 application package, found no basis for the undue influence claim, and communicated their finding to Archie's attorney yesterday morning. The challenge was withdrawn the same day. One beat. Then, it's done. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Call me if anything comes in. Otherwise, you're finished." I said I understood. That was all. I set the folder down. I opened the bedroom closet and placed it back on the top shelf, precisely centered. Exactly where it had been since 2019. I stood in the kitchen and waited for the kettle. I thought about Lloyd's face on that Saturday afternoon in the kitchen with the afternoon light on the table and the envelope between us. He had been satisfied, not proud, not vindicated, just satisfied. the satisfaction of a man who had done a careful thing correctly and then trusted it completely. He had been right. The document had done exactly what it was supposed to do, on exactly the timeline it was designed for, and there had been nothing anyone could do to alter that, because Lloyd had made it so before any of them had thought to look. Gordon Sr. sent a card in April. Standard, a printed sentiment, his name written below, a line saying he hoped I was well. I opened it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, read it twice, and filed it in the folder labeled Correspondence. I did not respond. I did not know what I could have said that was both honest and kind. And I had decided some time earlier that I would not sacrifice the first quality for the second, which left me with silence, delivered without drama and without an explanation I had not been asked for. Marisol texted in late April, a single message saying she was sorry for how things had gone. I thanked her, and I meant it. What I understood about Marisol was that she had known more than she had said, and that the cost of saying it had been too high for her, and that this was a different kind of failing than not knowing at all. I filed it, as I file most things, under the category of costs that cannot be recovered. I went back to medical coding in September. Part-time, remote. 3 long-term clients, whose claim structures I knew well enough to work quickly. The precision was a relief, not a distraction from grief, because grief does not work that way, but a different texture within the same days. You are right or you are wrong about what a coverage code means. There is a specific steadiness in that kind of certainty. The steadiness of work that produces verifiable answers in a year that it offered very few. I sat at the desk in the home office, Lloyd's construction drawings still in a tube in the corner, a detail I have not changed and do not plan to, and I coded claims and drank my coffee and looked out at the Federal Hill Street, where the neighbors were doing the ordinary things that life continues requiring, regardless of what has happened inside any particular house. The Federal Hill house is mine now in a way I am still learning. It was ours for 7 years, and it is mine now. And those are not the same thing, and I will not pretend they are, but I am learning what mine means in this particular version of things. The $1.8 million is in a managed account. The probate share of the $250,000 company policy is in a separate account. I think about what Lloyd intended, and I try to honor it. He said he wanted me to have something that was just mine. It is mine. The money arrived through grief, and the gravity of that is its own thing, separate from the amount, not diminished by the amount, and I carry both. There is a morning, now, in a Providence winter, when I stand in the kitchen with the light coming in at its low angle, and I think about all of it. The chair at the edge of Gordon Sr.'s sitting room, the company policy on the low table, Archie's voice in that 8th second of silence, Renata's clean desk with 2 policies lying side by side. I think about the red accordion folder on the top shelf, red and still and completely unchanged. And I think about what Lloyd understood that the Barker family never did. That the most important thing you can do for someone you love is ensure that when you are gone, no one, not a well-organized family, not an estate process, not a formal challenge filed 6 weeks after your death, can stand between them and what you intended them to have. Archie spent 4 days after the funeral organizing his assumptions about where I stood. He had good chairs and a policy summary and the particular confidence of a man who has never been wrong about something this size before. Lloyd spent a Saturday in March 2019 making sure that none of those assumptions would hold. He filed the application on a Monday. He paid the premium every year. He told no one. Some people show you what you mean to them with declarations. Lloyd showed me with a document. And the document did exactly what it was supposed to do. If you had been sitting in that chair at the edge of the room, listeners, holding a folder no one in that room knew existed. Would you have said anything? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Share this with someone who has ever been managed when they should have been trusted. Thank you for listening.